thank you everyone for joining us today. Um, we are really excited to be getting into the last stretch of the petition period here, gathering signatures for the Harvard Forward candidates, and offering events to our supporters to get to hear more directly about the candidates, hear about other members from the Harvard community, and learn about how all these, all these different members of the community tied together with the Harvard Forward platform. So, for I assume everyone on here is familiar with Harvard Forward, but the really quick high-level overview is we are running petition candidates to the Harvard Board of Overseers, which is a democratically elected body within Harvard's governance, on a platform that is forward-looking, that we think is what will require for Harvard to maintain its leadership status in the 21st century, and we need alumni to support us, alumni who believe in this mission, to nominate our candidates, sign their petition so they can get on the ballot, and then vote for them in the spring elections later this year. So the event today is going to be focusing, first of all, on Megan Redshirt Shaw, one of our 3 wonderful candidates for this year. We are also going to be talking a lot about inclusive governance, which is one of the big parts of Harvard mission, is making Harvard's governance more inclusive. And so we're excited also to have former U.S. Senator Tim Wirth, who's a college class 61 grad and ed school class 65 grad, and current PhD student Brandon Mancilla, who is the president of the Harvard Grad Student Union, join us so they can bring their perspectives about governance and power at Harvard into the discussion. So I'll have the panelists introduce themselves, talk a little bit about who they are, their Harvard ties, and why they're here today. So Megan, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll go ahead and introduce myself in Lakota first. Michajiki Megan Redshirt Shaw, call me Chajiki Chankwaштemi, Wazia Hanaha Hemataha Malakota. My name is Megan Redshirt Shaw. I'm a Harvard Graduate School of Education graduate in 2017. I currently am the Director of Native Student Services at the University of South Dakota, and I'm also a doctoral student at the University of Minnesota studying higher education, really interested in looking at Native student success, land acquisition by higher education, and then also how those things are tied together in land-based reparations, through tuition and other ways for Native students. So I'm really looking forward to being here and having this conversation. My professional background was in undergraduate admissions and college counseling. Now I'm on the student services side, which has been tremendous. But I am somebody that is very passionate about higher education and about the possibility of change for many of our institutions as well. So I'm really excited to be on this panel and looking forward to hearing from everyone's perspectives today.
Awesome. Senator Wirth, do you want to introduce yourself next, if you've sorted it out with Danielle's help?
Happy to. Is that we've had technical problems? Is that coming through?
We're all good.
Good. Well, thank you very much. Delighted you all are doing this. As pointed out, I was a class of 61, a scholarship student at Harvard. Have been involved with Harvard for more than 60 years, believe it or not. I was not only a student there, but was a proctor and a member of the admissions team for a number of years. And then in the 1990s was asked to join the Board of Overseers by a group, which I did, and I spent 6 years as a member of the Board of Overseers. I've been long deeply committed to Harvard and what Harvard has stood for historically, and have been involved in the divest movement at Harvard for the last 10 years. I have a long history of climate activity. I was the chair of the famous Hansen hearings in 1988, which really brought climate to the attention of the country more than any other single hearing, I think, and sponsored the first really long, comprehensive climate legislation. When I left the Senate, I then went to the State Department working for President Clinton, and had the responsibility there for climate change, and was the chair of the delegation and the negotiation on the Kyoto Protocol. After being in the State Department, I was Ted Turner asked me to please come and head up his new foundation, the UN Foundation, and we made climate change our highest priority, working with the institutions to try to get people to really understand the importance of climate change. Getting Harvard to change, we will talk about. I think that's the purpose of the hour today, And I would be happy to come back to that. I've got a lot of thoughts about the institution, a lot of affection for Harvard, which is matched only by my frustration at their inability to recognize their moral and climate responsibilities in this area. So thanks a lot and it looks like it's going to be a good discussion.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. Brandon, you want to round this out?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Brandon Mancilla. I'm a fourth year PhD student in the history department studying Latin American and Caribbean history. And I'm also the president of the Harvard Graduate Students Union, affiliated with the UAW. Our local number is 5118. We represent about 5,000 student workers at Harvard, teaching fellows, lab research assistants, and even undergrad course assistants as well. The academic labor movement has been growing for a few decades, and it's definitely taking off now in the private university sector. And I think we at Harvard are making history as one of the few universities that has reached a collective bargaining agreement with a private university. And just excited to be part of that project. I got involved since I arrived on campus in 2017 and slowly went from a department organizer to a full-time organizer now to on the executive board as the president and on the new bargaining team. We negotiated a historic contract last year. It was a one-year contract, so we're going to go back to the bargaining table with Harvard hopefully this spring, and looking forward to keeping you all updated on that. And we've appreciated Harvard Forward's support all this time, and just would love to keep our conversations and relationship going.
Awesome. Thank you all. Thank you all for joining. I think in order to frame the discussion, and one question we've gotten a lot from Harvard Forward supporters is, what is the Board of Overseers? What do they do? So Senator Wirth, I think if you could start us off just by talking a little bit about your experience as an overseer. Tell us, how you, worked with the Harvard administration, what powers the board has, and why alumni should care about these elections.
Okay, good. Well, those are all very good questions. Step back, Harvard has two governing boards. The oldest one is the Board of Overseers. The one that really makes a difference is the corporation. There are 15 or 16 members of the corporation, and they really effectively own the university and call the shots. The overseers are meant to be a kind of outside advisory group of helping to oversee the university's offerings and thoughts about what its academics are doing. The overseers does visitations to various departments, does reports every year. There's 36 members of the corporation, 6 are elected every year, I think. And the corporation, I've always thought, should be a lot more important and used a lot more by the university than it is. The talent on the Board of Overseers is very deep. People who are on the Board of Overseers are largely very, very experienced, often very well known, with lots of commitment to Harvard. But they are really they're more pro forma right now than I believe that they should be. They allegedly do some overseeing of departments, which they do, visitations of the departments, but they have almost nothing to do with Harvard governance, which I've always thought was a tremendous mistake, as it's easy for institutions like the corporation to become extremely insular and isolated. And I think one of the purposes of the overseers is to sort of open it up and let a little sunshine in and really start to think about some of the broader governance issues that Harvard faces. Obviously, a central governance issue relates to the endowment. For many years, Harvard has argued that nobody can get to know anything about the endowment. It's the most closed system, I think, of any institution I've ever dealt with. And they are so opaque that they won't answer mail even to members of the overseers. They report only to the corporation. They have claimed for many, many years that they're managed only for the purposes of financial return. and that any kind of, quote, political, unquote, consideration should not be taken into account. That obviously demands a real reckoning. I mean, the idea that you have the largest endowment of any institution in the country, and that endowment should not be managed consistent with the other goals of the university. Harvard has really significant goals related to teaching and research in climate, which are terrific. But it also has this very, very large endowment, which has an impact both directly and indirectly on the climate. And it is my belief, and that of all of my colleagues who are working on this, and I think all the people at Harvard Forward, that Harvard has an obligation to manage its endowment just as it has the goals of teaching and research. The overseers can help that to happen. And if we can help to put more oomph behind the overseers, we've certainly gotten Harvard's attention in the last 2 or 3 years. It's about time. They're beginning to bend a little bit in the area of thinking about climate change and how they manage the endowment, and that's very important. Obviously, I think they were shaken by the last election of the overseers, in which 3 of the Harvard Forward candidates were elected. That's an indication of alumni who voting on this. That's what the alumni, if they didn't want to have the alumni voice, why have a vote? The Harvard alumni were voting and saying, we would like this to be opened up. We would like to have overseers who are really thinking a lot more about the endowment among other outside issues. So I think that the endowment is important now, more titular than real. I think it's becoming more important as the pressure is on, as the university is beginning to understand that there is a very, very important constituency out there, which happens to be students, faculty, and alumni. And it's a good thing for the university to pay attention to its own constituencies. We can come back to that, but that's a little history of the overseers and why I think it's important and how it can be strengthened, and in turn, that can help to strengthen Harvard.
Great, and thank you. Having those insights from someone who sat on the board themselves is really important. But I think this is a great segue for, Harvard Forward is a little bit about not just what the overseers are, but what they could be and what they should be. So Megan, do you want to talk a little bit about, why you chose to run as a petition candidate and the sort of vision that you have and Harvard Forward has for what Harvard governance could look like or should look like?
I think it's important for me to kind of share that the first time that I was made aware of Harvard Forward was through another Indigenous person named Dr. Kelsey Leonard. She was very favorable of the organization. And I think when she started talking to me about this and I was given the opportunity to be considered, I think I come from a very unique perspective. I grew up in higher education, I work in higher education, and now I'm trying to study and understand higher ed. I had a very powerful and transformative year when I was a master's student at the Graduate School of Education. There were a lot of things that were going on in the world that deeply impacted me as a person. The Dakota Access Pipeline was actually happening at the exact same time that I was starting my master's program. I was watching a lot of Indigenous people on the front lines, defending land, talking about the environment and the impacts that big oil had on our communities. And now living in the state of South Dakota, a place where the pipeline is running directly through, reflecting on my own experience as a Harvard student. I think that it's deeply important that we have representation that is really reflective of the world, of the country, while also really sort of thinking about how our own experiences are defined by the things that happen during our time at institutions. I work very directly with students. I understand often that we are not given an opportunity when we are students to have transparency from leadership in a lot of these higher education spaces. And I think for me, understanding Harvard Forward, understanding the community that Harvard Forward is about and in promoting, I think about my friends in my cohort at Hugsy. There were 50 of us that were deeply close to each other. We cared very much about the things that we were doing and being connected to one another. And those are the voices that I want to represent. I really want to represent other educators who are working with students, who are trying to understand why our institutions make harmful decisions. And I believe that the perspective that I bring would bring to the Board of Overseers would just be an opportunity to represent a demographic that I think for a lot of these conversations about climate change, we're continuing to sort of push forward and try to be a part of the table. And so I really hope that in being considered, in seeking signatures, and really hoping that I can make it to the ballot, that I continue to bring the things that I feel really passionately about to the table, and just continue to listen to people about what their hopes are for the future of Harvard, and really looking forward to continuing to get to know these issues and learning more from people who feel that their voices haven't been heard.
Awesome. Thank you, Megan. We're very lucky to have you carrying the torch for Harvard Forward in 2021. And now on to Brandon. You know, I think for a lot of people who are supporters of Harvard Forward attending here today, the idea of, you know, holding Harvard to its ideals and making Harvard a better place is well-founded, but, you know, in the abstract, we went to Harvard. You know, I don't plan on going back to Harvard anytime soon. And so what Harvard does today doesn't impact me directly, but there are people who are, you know, on campus today who are directly impacted by the decisions that Harvard administration makes and Harvard's governance. So can you talk a little bit about your work with the union and some of the struggles that you have had, you know, with the Harvard administration, and how you think those things could be better served by having more inclusive governance?
Yeah, I mean, working sort of at the intersection of higher ed and the labor movement sort of grants us the perspective, a pretty unique one, I think, in which we can see both sides of what Harvard's mission or operation is actually all about. It is, on the one hand, a tremendous educational institution with all these resources to educate and you know, provide all these breakthroughs and innovation and whatnot, and pedagogy. But then it's also a corporation. It's also interested in its financial return at the same time. And from a different perspective, Harvard is also not just a educational or business institution. It is also a community of employees, of students, of faculty, of alumni, etc. And oftentimes, I think among the constituents that we've laid out, we forget about workers. So students who are student workers occupy this very interesting position in which we're both. But at the same time, we're looking at a lot of folks who are right now custodial staff, dining staff, administrative staff, library staff, etc., who are facing very precarious situations with the economy and with the shutdowns and the different efforts to contain the virus, which obviously we need to put public health first, but people are definitely suffering economically. And having this opportunity to organize within my union, I've been able to see firsthand how much work and support is needed to be able to create a fair sort of economic situation for all the workers who also go to Harvard, who also have a claim to Harvard as community members, not just as employees. So, you know, what the senator said was really interesting to me because it pointed to the fact that we absolutely need to make changes. And this is a first step in order to actually open up the discussion about what is the endowment for. We're constantly told the endowment is untouchable because it's there for rainy day situations. What is more of a rainy day situation than a pandemic and a global economic crisis? We were told that the endowment might shrink because of all the operational costs and emergency costs that were going to have to be made this year in order to address the situation. We saw a 7% return or more on the endowment. So the endowment grew. So there's a detachment from the sort of financial abstraction of the endowment from the so-called real economy. And unfortunately, the real economy is where all the workers are, the people you know, whose salaries and wages are you know, where they are able to sort of make money in order to sustain their families and their communities and feed their children. So this split, I think, is extremely tragic, but it's not one that can't be changed. I think it's one of political will. And I think having these kinds of conversations are the first steps to changing the culture around the way we talk about economics and money at this institution.
Thank you. Okay, and so I think we've laid out a little bit of what Harvard looks like today, what is going on today. Now, looking forward, Senator Wirth, I think we would love to hear a little bit about your thoughts on what some of the strengths of Harvard's governance systems are, some of the weaknesses, and where we can focus to make an impact. And this, we're getting a question in the chat on, how do we work with overseers to actually make an impact on things like the endowment.
Great, Nathan. Well, let me start my comment by saying that. Just a second, let me turn something off here. Hang on a second. Too many devices. Let me start by going back to the comment that you made about the person asking you about the overseers. You said it really doesn't make any difference if you're out of Harvard, what doesn't impact your life. Well, that's not true. I mean, Harvard is going to have an impact on people's lives because it is who the institution is. There is no institution of higher education in the world, I think it's fair to say, with as much history, as much morals, as much potential suasion, as much leadership opportunity. When Harvard speaks, everybody listens. And so what Harvard says and does, related to the way in which it manages its endowment, people are going to listen and pay attention. Almost none of the other Ivy League schools have done anything about changing the focus of their environment. It's beginning a little bit. Cornell is beginning to make changes. Brown is beginning to make changes. Princeton says, don't talk about it. It's not allowed. We don't allow you to talk about it. Yale's starting to talk a little bit. Stanford's way out in front of Harvard. But if Harvard broke with the conventional wisdom and decided to do what Georgetown's done what Oxford has done what Cambridge has done, and to say we're going to divest from fossil fuels, that will have a very significant impact, not only on those institutions, but on helping the people to understand that we are as a society deeply in the thrall of fossil fuels. And the more we do as rapidly as we possibly can to get ourselves out of the thrall of fossil fuels, the more we understand that we've got to stop putting carbon up in the atmosphere, not next month, not 2,500, but now, that we have to begin to do that. Harvard should have an aggressive voice to say that should happen. That impacts on all of us and is enormously important. Now, can and should Harvard do that? Of course, we can come back and say that. There's no reason why Harvard can't do it. It's committed to a significant goal of becoming fossil fuel by 2050. It's saying that it's going to lay out a roadmap for that will be available sometime this spring. That's a good thing. I hope that includes milestones so that Harvard can be measured over a period of time. That would be a good thing. I hope it addresses fossil fuel use. That would be a good thing. I also think it'd be very good if Harvard addressed the issue of full disclosure of money coming in from the fossil fuel community into Harvard teaching and research. There's a lot of fossil fuel money. I will bet you anything, if there was an analysis of this, sloshing around various parts of the university. Now, that may be okay to have that kind of funding, but we ought to know if there are certain individuals who are receiving a lot of money from fossil fuel and doing research related to fossil fuels. Is there a potential conflict of interest? We shouldn't have to ask those questions. The university should require full disclosure of any outside money coming into teaching and research at the university. The medical school requires that, and there's no reason why the college can't require that as well. Because why don't they do it? Because maybe it's going on and they're embarrassed about enforcing a standard that might embarrass some faculty members who really are deeply enthralled to the fossil fuel industry. I don't know that there are, but because the university is so opaque, even about disclosure, it makes you want to think, oh, wait a minute, what's wrong here? Let's push a little bit and see what happens. That's the final point that I would make. By pushing and seeing what happens, you open up the possibility of different accountability. Doors will open, opportunities will open, questions will be raised. I think an aggressive group of young members of the Board of Overseers can be very helpful in that. Harvard obviously doesn't like that. They've done everything they can to discourage petition candidates in a way that reminds one of what any autocrat would do to try to discourage democratic elections and the availability of democratic voting lists. I mean, it's a case study of how you do it in the 19th century if you're an autocracy, but it's not a case study of how a modern institution works. You know, the voices of labor, the voices of indigenous people, the voices of students, the voices of faculty, you know, ought to have a place where they can be heard. That's the purpose of the overseers. And so the overseers, you know, got to really stick their foot in the door and say a lot more loudly than they have so far, or than they did when I was a member of the overseers, that this is important and let's pay attention, Harvard. It's time to join the 21st century.
Thank you. I think that's a really, really powerful statement about what, the role of the overseers could be if we elect people who care about making Harvard a better place. So Megan, I want to switch back over to you. As Senator Wirth says, there are a lot of moving pieces, a lot of things that we don't know, a lot of things that are opaque at Harvard. And so it won't be as easy as just getting elected and snapping your fingers and fixing everything. But you have a professional and academic background in higher education itself. So how would you bring that experience to the board in order to start to address these challenges that Harvard is facing?
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that's really exciting for me to see in the Q&A is that we actually have a prospective Harvard student who is here with us, who is considering Harvard as an institution. And I hope we get to his question. But I think that that's ultimately the perspective that I care about the most. I think about in my own work, really the most passionate time period that I feel the most excited about working with is really that time between your senior year of high school and your first year of college when you are selecting an institution. And for me in my research, in my professional work, I think that's the demographic and the population that places like Harvard, have a tremendous impact on. The opportunity to attend an institution, it can change your life. It can change the circumstances of your life, the things you become excited and passionate about. And so really understanding from the top down how much of an impact, I think a lot of times we look at institutions as sort of these large structures that are not personal in any way, and they're disconnected from the experiences of their students. And I really think that electing people to the Board of Overseers who understand it from that perspective of what does it really take for a student to make it through an institution like Harvard, and what should the priorities of that institution be? There's absolutely a selfish part of this that is saying that I am deeply fascinated by higher education. It infuriates me, it brings me joy, it causes me pain constantly, and I'm always trying to figure out different ways to look at it from different angles, ultimately to understand it for our students who matter so much. We talk often about, the decisions that they make and the larger scale impact that they make, and also about the undergraduate experience at places like Harvard. And so I think that it's the reason why I've entered into higher education. Often I'm asked, why do I love working with 17 to 22-year-olds? I think it's one of the hardest periods of our lives. And there's so much that we find out about ourselves and our interests. But for me, it's really wanting to see one of the most powerful institutions in the world talk about the decisions that it makes that really ultimately impact students and student voices. I also, really want to echo what Senator Wirth was saying about education and the impact that Harvard has. The decisions that it makes, everybody is looking at. We see that across higher education. I saw it in undergraduate admissions. And so their stances on these issues that impact the next generation of future leadership matter. And so we need to start having voices at the table that understand and deeply care that is central to who they are. It's central to the decisions that they make. And for someone like me, higher education wasn't created with me in mind, but it doesn't mean that it can't pave a pathway forward to have students like me in mind, or have students who have often been underrepresented at the front of their minds. So those are some of the reasons, just really being student-centered and understanding higher education from a different perspective. I think those are some of the things that I'm really excited about with that possibility. And again, to our prospective student, for students like you that are making a decision about what institution is going to define their own educational journeys.
Great, thank you. And then Brandon, I'm going to ask you one more question, and then we're going to move on to the Q&A questions from the audience. Back to Senator Wirth's point about, really the high likelihood that the university is, and society as a whole is in the thrall of fossil fuels, and it's really hard to kick that. There's an undercurrent to almost all Harvard activism that you're really always fighting against, big forces, and Harvard is such a powerful institution that getting it to budge even an inch seems impossible at times. So can you talk about some of the organizing that the union has done, some of the lessons that you've learned in securing what are really, tremendous victories in some cases for your movement that we can all learn from?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest historical lesson of the labor movement has always been strength in numbers. You are the majority. And I think any campaign that takes on a institution, an organization, or a corporation with a lot of money and resources and power and influence needs to just be able to garner a certain amount of mass support, whatever the mass means in this case, in order to show that you have a legitimate stake and can pose an actual threat to the way things are going. In this case, for our organizing, for us, it was organizing towards a strike, being able to have over 1,000 student workers walk off the job, join the picket line for close to a month, to be able to tell Harvard, look, you can't ignore the demands from student workers about the persistence of discrimination and harassment in the workplace, and that the mechanisms we have in place are not enough. You can't ignore the fact that there are, specialist visits and mental health visit costs are way too high, and that the cost of living in Cambridge and the Boston area is way too high based on how, inadequate raises or years without raises are. So all of that, all of the organizing that went into that was basically motivated by the simple idea that if you get thousands of people behind you to be able to show an institution that you actually have the numbers behind a mass demand, then that is when change happens. And that's when progress is able to be made in negotiations and reforms are made to the way procedural systems operate and whatnot. So similarly here for, I think for issues of divestment from fossil fuels or from the prison industrial complex or from changes that we want to make to the endowment beyond that, I think being able to tap into the different networks available to us, Harvard's student body, workers, alumni, faculty, et cetera. I think being able to show that that these demands are things that interest the entire community, and that it's a minority of interests that, though powerful, are actually unpopular and unsustainable in the long term. That's when things will be able to actually change. So that's sort of our theory of power, and it has been, and it's something that we continually test, given that we are still organizing. But I think it's a classic labor movement strategy that I think a lot of other activists could also learn from as well.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so we're gonna move over to some mix of discussion amongst yourselves and questions from the audience. Here's one that I think really gets to the core of what we're trying to figure out today is from Danny L. What evidence do we have that the corporation will act as recommended by the overseers? And Senator Wirth, I don't know if you want to start us off on that, talking about your experience in dealing with the corporation, and then maybe Meg and Brandon, you can talk about not just directly does the corporation listen to the overseers, but can we create a mandate for change that is too big to ignore? Senator Wirth, you're on mute. There you go.
Let's remember the overseers are not a line management organization like the corporation is. It's an advisory group essentially, and it's there to provide advice and oversight for the university. Historically, it's done that by visiting departments and pointing out what it believes are strengths and weaknesses of those departments and what ought to be done. And that's a fine role. What we're trying to do is to say that the overseers ought to also as well have a role in overseeing how Harvard invests $42 billion and what that looks like to the outside world. That is part of Harvard's mission. Now, Harvard for years has said forever that they're not going to do that, that they don't organize, they don't manage the endowment for, quote, political purposes, unquote. And by the way, we don't want to, quote, demonize the fossil fuel industry, unquote. Some very unfortunate statements by the university, but maybe they're coming around to just see that changes at by the endowment are important, and the overseers can be helpful in pushing on that and illustrating it. And I think maybe there are a number of corporation members who've never heard this sort of thing, a discussion of the impact of organized labor. I've never discussed the Dakota pipeline and what energy needs means to communities in the country, the relationship between all of these things, the environment, climate change, and how that's related to the investment portfolio of the university. These are fresh and important voices. We can't say that there's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things that get accomplished, but over time, you slowly but surely make change. You slowly but surely get the institution to mature and join the 21st century. You know, the idea that there was a strike at Harvard and Harvard had to pay attention, you know, that didn't happen overnight. That took a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of work, and was very important to do. And I think the fact that there's so much attention now being given as well to the endowment, Harvard's moving around, albeit slowly. It's like the vast ocean liner moving through at 32 knots, and you got to get it to shift and change. And maybe it will by the time you get to, you know, a long way down the line. But you got to keep pushing. You have to persist, and it doesn't happen overnight.
Megan or Brandon, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think I would just say that, you know, the corporation has to be made to understand that these changes are absolutely essential, and that by not doing something or by not taking a stand or making a decision, they're actually already acting politically. And they're acting in the political interest of the fossil fuel industry and any other industries that we consider ethically problematic for the interests of justice and fairness and equality.
Excellent point, Brendan. That's right on target. Good for you.
All right. Okay, here's another question from the audience. This one's for Brandon. You know, many of those who helped create or support the union are now alumni. How can Harvard Forward better connect with those alumni to understand their perspectives and get their support for our candidacy to put the issues that we care about on the ballot?
Yeah, thank you, Yvette. That's a great question. I think it'd be great to sort of create some kind of continuity from graduating from Harvard and becoming an alum and supporting Harvard Forward candidates, or even running to have an HCSU organizer someday become a Harvard Forward candidate would be awesome. But I think in general, so far, what this has meant that is that Harvard Forward has reached out to us as a union, and we've made sure to publicize and send out different petitions and updates from Harvard Forward to our membership. A lot of our membership are people who have like standing master's degrees, meaning that they are already alumni, even though they're still working towards their PhD. So I'm one of those people. I got my master's 2 years ago, but I'm still working towards my PhD. So a lot of us are actually quite interested in this process. So we're already involved and voting. But yeah, there are a lot of alumni networks at this university. And I think HGSU is also building one, since we've been organizing now for about 6-7 years. So yeah, trying to solidify those networks is really important to us. And I think that's why this event is so important, just for us to continue these dialogues.
Great. Thank you. Okay. The latest question that came in is, who makes the rules? Senator Wirth referenced changes to limit petition candidates. Who made that happen? I think before we get into the rule changes, this is actually something that I want to bring up. The Harvard has the equivalent maybe of a constitution in its charter, and the charter actually references that Harvard. Megan, actually, do you want to talk about the charter a little bit?
Yes, so Harvard's charter, original charter actually for the creation of the school, states inside of it that it was founded for the education of Indian and English youth. And actually what Harvard was doing at the time was they were having issues with fundraising, which we know now to not be an issue for Harvard, but at the time they were having issues with raising funding. And so some of the ways that they were able to raise funding was through saying that part of their promise was that they were going to educate young Native men who were sort of going to serve as diplomats for themselves between local tribal nations and the institution, and obviously what was sort of going on in their communities at the time. And so a lot of times Native alumni who have gone through Harvard have kind of used this. There is a very small plaque in Harvard Yard. It is a black on black plaque. It is behind a bike rack. It's very, very small, but it talks about sort of that original mission of Harvard's charter and being committed to educating Native youth. I think over the next few decades, they only had a handful of Native people who ended up benefiting from that agreement, but it actually was sort of the foundation of Harvard's endowment. And so it's something that I always try to bring when I'm talking about sort of Native experiences at Harvard, and something that I've always just found really interesting about the founding of the institution.
Brendan, we're going to have to go out and find that plaque.
Yeah, it's behind a bike rack. You can see it's sort of in the corner of Harvard Yard, and something that I think the first Native graduate of Harvard was a gentleman named Caleb Chisa-Matuk, and there's a huge portrait of him in the freshman dining hall that you can see there, and that was sort of part of his legacy. I saw his signature in the archives, which was a really powerful moment for me as a student, but it is a part of sort of Harvard's founding that we don't talk about a lot. And what are the legacy and commitments to Indigenous people that Harvard has from that very founding part of their charter that still exists and still is there today too.
You know, Brendan, going back to the question about being in touch and so on, you ask a good question. You know, I think that the HAA, the Harvard Alumni Association, you know, is really making an effort, and they're having this series of 4. They know that you know, they're under a lot of heat, a lot of criticism. I don't say heat, but a lot of criticism, and I think they're trying to respond. I think their last slate of candidates was a very strong and good one, and that's terrific. But you know, they should be attentive to what information goes out to alumni. And I would agree with you that information about these missions, you know, whether that mission is thinking about the management of the endowment or thinking about the plaque behind the bike rack, you know, I mean, who knows about, I mean, that is a symptom of Harvard's broader mission. And is it maintaining that or not? There's some really interesting things that seems to me the HAA could and should be doing. Of course, we're all buried with information, but Harvard Magazine is another, I think, extraordinarily good forum. That it's a really good publication, and they care a great deal about these kinds of issues, and important there. Final point that I would make, Megan, is that Harvard has to really have a major financial commitment, and raising money is, you know, a major focus of theirs. That's why we crawl back into the thrall of the fossil fuel industry. I think that there is sort of a silent, maybe unexpressed fear of retaliation or whatever by the fossil fuel community, but it's happening everywhere, that people are getting out of fossil fuels. They're not good investments. They don't make a lot of sense for any kind of good endowment management. And Harvard doesn't want to probably admit that publicly, admit that out front, but I think it's probably already happening. So there are strains of progress that I think are very important, and what you guys are doing is part of that and part of the future of the university. You're to be commended.
Thank you. And I think it's really important to remember that when we're talking about holding Harvard to its own ideals, we're not just talking about things in the abstract. We were talking about, Harvard has made a commitment to Native American communities since it was founded in writing, and we should hold them to it. So that was the framing of who makes the rules. Is Harvard has a charter. Almost everything that Harvard has to pass as new rules has to be in compliance with the charter, but they can make a lot of rules on top of the charter the same way that the US can make laws on top of the Constitution. So who makes the rules and who decides, what goes and what doesn't go at the university level? Senator Wirth, if you want to start us off.
Well, the corporation does. I mean, that's the corporation essentially, if you think about it as a corporation, it owns the university. Corporation is the legal governing body, and they have the authority over the endowment. They have the authority over, almost every decision that gets made in the university. How carefully do they watch these? It's a much better corporation than it used to be. It's now 15 people. It used to be 8 or 9. It was a much more cloistered and isolated community. I think it's better now. I think Lee is doing a very impressive job. He's managing all of the responsibilities related to the lawsuits on Harvard admissions, and he's I think doing that in a very, very productive and constructive way, much to be admired. He's got a huge job on his shoulders to be the head of this very large corporation. So they make the rules. Did they make the rule related to limiting the numbers of people that could run for the Board of Overseers? I would suspect that HAA did not make that decision without making a call over to University Hall or to the corporation saying, what are we going to do about this? And they all got together and decided what they do is to artificially limit the numbers of people that could run. The minute I saw that, I was outraged. Bill McKibben was outraged. I thought it was one of the most undemocratic things I'd seen in a long time. And it was exacerbated by the fact that if you're running for the overseers, it's almost impossible to get a list of Harvard alumni. So it's, you can think of the kind of the Southern county chairman, managing an election in the deep South, 100 years ago. What you're going to do is limit the numbers of people who can run. And then even if they can run, they can't see who's on the voting roll. So we're going to be able to control it anyway. I mean, that's a lot of what it looked like to me. I think it was an embarrassing statement for the university to make. And maybe they'll come around and come off that. They had some rationale for doing it. But the HAA made that decision, they say. But that wouldn't have been done without a good call to Harvard's lawyers, I'm sure.
Yeah, and I'll add, just for context for those who don't know, after Harvard Forward was successful in electing 3 petition candidates over the summer last year, within a month, the university announced they were going to change the rules of the election to make it harder and impossible, really, for more than 6 petition candidates to ever serve on the board at the same time. This is a pattern over history, which gets to actually the question by Wendy Zarin about what we can learn from previous activism in the 80s, specifically from divestment from South Africa, that there was a group of alumni that ran candidates for the Board of Overseers on a South African divestment platform during apartheid. And they won seats. And after a couple of years of winning seats, Harvard said, you know what, we need to figure out a way to deal with this. And they changed the rules and they made it harder for them to win. So, we're fighting, again, back to the earlier point, always against the current, but really trying to hold Harvard to its highest ideals. I think, we still have a couple minutes
fighting
here.
City Hall, Nathan, fighting City Hall.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I want to make sure, no, that's fine. I want to make sure that we have some time for if there's anything that the panelists want to ask of each other. I know all 3 of you have different but very valuable experiences at Harvard that you can learn from each other. So if there's anything that you want to touch on or share before.
Well, what reaction have you gotten to your candidacy? I mean, let me ask you, Megan, what have you heard from people who you knew, or who you knew here, or, in the outside world? What are they saying? What are you doing? Any upstart young woman trying to get on the board, one of the governing boards of this famous and wealthy institution. They've never had a Native American on the board. Come on, what do you think you're doing? What'd you hear?
I think that it has made me, I think that I honestly, one of the earlier questions that was presented was sort of this idea of like alumni walking away from the institution and not caring about what's going on the inside. And I think it goes back to what you had shared earlier, Senator Wirth, that like absolutely the decisions that Harvard makes impact everybody that's in education and in higher education and across the world in research and breakthroughs. And I think throughout this process, it has made me really realize how deeply important it is to have representation in an institution that is as powerful as Harvard. The reaction that I've gotten, I have most of my closest connections are non-Harvard. So I think that, and I've talked about this a lot with Harvard Forward, just Harvard kind of being Harvard, right? And really limiting these power structures to people that have any sort of close connection or close ties to it. But I think that I really think about my friend, all of my friends from the year that I was at Harvard are either in education or Native people. So the two things that are most important to me in my life are representative of the people that I'm closest to that are connected to Harvard. And so there's been excitement. I've had a lot of people tell me they wish they could vote for me, but they're not connected to Harvard. So continuing to just work really hard to gain signatures. I just want to say thank you so much to anybody that's on the call that has submitted my name. You're taking a huge leap of faith. I know that you don't know me personally, but I really believe that I will bring a voice that will be representative of things that you care about. And I'm just deeply grateful to Harvard Forward for giving me the opportunity to even do this. We still need signatures. We still need people to put us on the ballot in the first place. Please help me get even a fighting chance to possibly make it to the Board of Overseers. So I know that wasn't supposed to be a plug for signatures, but those are right. Those are the things that, right now we just have to really work hard in the next few weeks to see if we can put our names on the ballot.
Well, that was the next thing on the agenda was the plug. So, we want to make sure that everyone who's here today not only has signed the petition themselves, but has told all of their Harvard connections to also sign the petitions. We expect we're somewhere around 2/3 of the way through. We have 15 days left, so it's really going to be a sprint. HarvardForward.org/sign has all the information that you need. And we really appreciate any help in helping us get to 3,000. So with that, just if each of you wants to share parting thoughts, and then we'll call it a day and let people go about their Saturday. Senator Wirth, you want to start first, and then we'll go with Brandon, and then Megan.
Sure. As I said before, I think what you all are doing, what Harvard Forward is doing, is extremely important. This university is terribly important to the world. It's important to our country, and it's been obviously important to all of us. And the more the university is moving into the 21st century and recognizing its rapidly changing responsibilities, the better it's going to be. And we can help it do that. That's what you all are doing. And it's very constructive. And, I have great admiration for the two of you wanting to run, and for Harvard Forward for putting this together. And Nathan, thank you for keeping us in line here. We wouldn't get too excited about the Dakota Access Pipeline this afternoon, although we could get cranked up about it, couldn't we? Okay, thank you all.
Brandon, do you want to share some?
Yeah, well, thanks for the invitation. It was great to sort of think through some different strategies of how to continue our collaboration. I do want to say, though, that as always, Harvard does respond by changing its structures, as Megan and the senator have both said. We are currently fighting right now to sort of retain a lot of our membership unit, because the School of Public Health in particular has considered certain teaching assistants no longer eligible for membership in a union and therefore stripping them of their union rights. So we're fighting that. So just as a way of just echoing a lot of the things we talked about here, once a movement or a group does get a foot in the door, Harvard does find different ways to try to take some of that power back. So this is an ongoing fight, and definitely appreciate the support from you all so far.
I just want to say thank you for spending your Saturday afternoon with us. And again, just really grateful to be with Senator Wirth and Brandon today. And again, the only way that I can make a difference through the Harvard Forward platform is if I can get on the ballot and be given a fighting shot. So any opportunity that you have, anybody that you know that went to Harvard, please encourage them to support myself and our two other amazing candidates who I know have events coming up similar to this. It's really, really just exciting to even have the opportunity to potentially have my voice be heard on behalf of people and communities that I care about very deeply. So I just want to say, Pilame, thank you so much for joining us today and giving us the opportunity to share our perspectives as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you to all our panelists. Thank you to all our guests. Like Megan said, we will have an event with Natalie next weekend, Sunday at 2 p.m. Eastern. And then the weekend after that with Yvette. So, people get to hear from all our candidates. We also have an event tomorrow geared towards volunteer opportunities with the campaign to make sure that we get on the ballot. All of these events you can register for. You can check the times at harvardforward.org/events. So we hope that you enjoyed the conversation today and you will join us in the future. All right. Thanks, everyone.